Hey guys, tonight we're easing ourselves into a royal court that smells faintly of beeswax, damp stone, and ambition that's already gone a little sour. You're standing inside early 16th century England, where tapestries try very hard to keep out the cold, and where everyone pretends not to notice how loud the king's footsteps are. This is the world of Henry VIII, before the portraits turn heavy. Before the rage becomes legendary. Before the wives become a counting rhyme. Right now, he's young, athletic, charming, and dangerously convinced that the universe is personally rooting for him. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive long here, mostly because politics. But also because the ale is questionable and everyone's smiling a bit too hard. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stay where you are. Because moving too quickly in a Tudor court is how people notice you. And being noticed is rarely healthy. Henry is barely 18 when he becomes king in 1509. And you can feel the optimism buzzing through the corridors. This is the popular historical image everyone knows, the Golden Prince. Tall, broad-shouldered, trained in music, languages, and sport, he writes poetry, he hunts tirelessly, he dances well enough that people comment on it, out loud. Repeatedly, just to be safe. You hear laughter echo off stone walls. The kind that feels rehearsed but still warm. England has come off years of cautious rule under Henry VII. And now it feels like the windows have been opened. Feasts are larger. Clothes are brighter. The king wants to be seen, admired, loved, and right now, that's easy. You sense how intoxicating this is, for him. And for everyone feeding off his energy. A well-known event anchors this moment. Henry's immediate marriage to Catherine of Aragon. His brother's widow. It's politically sensible, publicly celebrated, and framed as a continuation of stability. The court breathes easier. You notice how much relief matters here. Peace, even fragile peace, is treated like a gift. But here's a quieter detail most people overlook. Henry doesn't just inherit a crown. He inherits expectations heavy enough to bend it. He is supposed to be strong, decisive, virile, and above all, fruitful. Sons matter, heirs matter. You can almost feel the unspoken countdown begin the moment the wedding bells fade. Some historians still debate whether Henry's later obsession with male heirs comes from personal insecurity or dynastic paranoia inherited from his father's shaky claim to the throne. For now, though, things feel almost gentle. You watch Henry at prayer. Genuinely devout, convinced God favors him. Religion isn't a weapon yet, it's a comfort, a structure. A reassurance that order exists. The irony hums softly in the background. Unnoticed. You catch small, human moments that never make it into grand narratives. Henry laughs too loudly at his own jokes. He hates being told, no, even kindly. He thrives on admiration the way a modern celebrity thrives on notifications. Check often. React badly when they slow down. It's harmless now. It won't stay that way. Catherine, beside him, carries herself with dignity and patience. She's older, experienced, deeply religious. She believes this marriage is her destiny, sanctified and unbreakable. Watching them together, you'd never guess how brittle the future is. Historians still argue whether Henry ever truly loved her, or whether affection was always conditional on success, specifically reproductive success. As night settles over the palace, torches flicker and music drifts lazily through the halls. You feel how history is holding its breath. Nothing is wrong yet. That's the unsettling part. This story doesn't begin with cruelty or blood. It begins with promise, confidence, and a young king who believes he can have everything without paying much attention to the cost. You linger a moment longer, letting the warmth of this early rain soften your thoughts, knowing, without needing to be told, that comfort like this never lasts long in stories like these. You don't feel a hard cut between joy and pressure, it seeps in gradually. Like a draft slipping through stone walls. The court is still bright, still noisy, but now you notice how often conversations circle back to the same subject. Always gently, always indirectly. Catherine of Aragon has been queen for years. And England is still waiting. Waiting is dangerous here. Waiting gives people time to imagine alternatives. You walk beside Catherine through long corridors where sunlight barely reaches the floor. She moves with quiet assurance. Practiced at being observed, she has been a queen before. Briefly. And she understands what endurance looks like. Everyone knows the popular story. Catherine is the devoted wife, loyal and pious, standing by Henry through war, ceremony, and prayer. That part is true. What's less often mentioned is how physically and emotionally exhausting her role becomes. Pregnancy follows pregnancy. Most end quietly. Without celebration, without lasting life. Here's the strange detail that tends to fade from memory. Catherine becomes pregnant at least 6 times. Only one child survives infancy, Mary. Each loss happens behind closed doors. Announced softly, then absorbed into silence. You feel the weight of that repetition. It's not dramatic, it's grinding. Some historians still debate how much these losses affect Henry emotionally versus politically. But standing here, you can feel how disappointment hardens into anxiety. The well-known historical pressure is clear enough. England needs a male heir. The Wars of the Roses are not ancient memory yet, they're recent trauma. Everyone remembers what happens when succession is unclear. Henry remembers too, even if he doesn't talk about it. You sense him watching Catherine more closely now, not cruelly. Not yet, but with calculation creeping in around the edges. Religion frames everything. Catherine believes, absolutely, that her marriage is lawful and blessed. She was married to Henry's brother, Arthur, but insists, steadfastly, that the marriage was never consummated. This detail matters enormously, because it keeps her conscience clear and her faith intact. It also means she sees Henry's growing doubts not as marital trouble, but as spiritual danger. Some historians still argue whether Arthur and Catherine's marriage was ever truly consummated. But in this room, belief carries more weight than evidence. Henry begins to read scripture differently. You notice it first in his tone, curious, defensive, searching. He lingers on passages about kings and judgment, about divine favor and punishment. The idea creeps in that God might be withholding a son as correction. It's a terrifying thought for a king raised to believe God and monarchy are intertwined. If God is displeased, the fault must be fixed. Court life subtly reorganizes itself around this anxiety. Advisors whisper. Clerics offer interpretations. Everyone has an opinion, carefully tailored to the king's mood that day. Catherine, meanwhile, remains outwardly calm. She performs her duties, hosts ambassadors, governs as regent while Henry is away at war. A fact that often surprises people. She is competent, respected, and politically skilled. Some historians still debate whether her strength ironically hastens her downfall by reminding Henry that she cannot give him the one thing he wants most. There's a dark, almost modern humor to the way blame shifts. Medical understanding is limited, but responsibility rarely feels shared. You notice how Catherine's body becomes the quiet focus of national frustration. As if England itself is waiting on her alone. No one says it outright. But it hangs in the air. If something is wrong, it must be her fault. Henry distracts himself with spectacle. Tournaments grow more elaborate, feasts louder. He competes aggressively, as if physical dominance might translate into dynastic certainty. You watch him ride hard, fall harder, laugh it off. For now, the body that will later betray him is still cooperative. The confidence remains intact. Yet something is shifting. You catch Henry looking at younger women just a second too long. Not desire yet, possibility. Alternatives forming quietly in the background. Catherine notices. She always notices. But she chooses dignity over confrontation. Faith over fear. Some historians argue this patience costs her everything. Others believe resistance earlier would have changed nothing. Standing here, you suspect both may be true. As evening settles again, candles flicker against walls that have heard centuries of promises and prayers. You feel the court holding itself together through routine and hope. Nothing has broken yet, but cracks are forming, thin, almost invisible, running beneath the polished surface. You let your breathing slow, aware that the story is leaning forward now, toward a moment when waiting will no longer feel like an option. The waiting grows heavier, and you feel it in small, uncomfortable ways. How conversations stall. How smiles arrive a fraction too late. Nothing has changed officially, yet everything feels conditional now. You walk through the chapel where candles burn steadily, and you sense how prayer has shifted from gratitude to negotiation. Catherine kneels longer than before. Henry watches from a distance, arms folded, jaw set, as if faith itself might blink first. This is the phase history often compresses. But living inside it feels endless. Years pass without a son. Mary grows from infant to child. Bright and serious, already aware she is important and yet somehow insufficient. You notice how Henry treats her kindly, even proudly, while still speaking of her as if she's a placeholder. A daughter is loved, a son is required. That distinction hums quietly through every room. A well-known event anchors this tension. Henry begins formally questioning the validity of his marriage. He doesn't announce it dramatically. He tests the idea, floats it through trusted advisors, watches reactions carefully. The argument centers on scripture, specifically the claim that marrying a brother's widow is forbidden. Henry convinces himself this isn't desire talking, it's obedience. Some historians still debate whether Henry truly believes this interpretation or whether belief conveniently follows need. Here's a strange, lesser-known detail that drifts past you. Henry spends years seeking a solution within the church first. He isn't trying to break anything yet. He writes letters. He consults theologians. He sends envoys to Rome. This is a man who still sees himself as a loyal Catholic king. Even as his problem grows more urgent, the irony settles in slowly. Like a fog, Catherine responds with quiet resolve. She refuses to waver, refuses to retreat into silence. She insists, publicly, privately, that her marriage is lawful, her conscience clear. You watch her hold this line with impressive calm. It's not stubbornness, it's identity. To admit the marriage is wrong would unravel her entire life. Some historians argue Catherine's unwavering stance hardens Henry's resolve. Others believe any softness would have been interpreted as weakness. Standing here, you feel how impossible her position really is. The court grows polarized. Advisors choose sides cautiously. Cardinal Wolsey works feverishly to engineer a solution that keeps everyone happy. A task that grows more unrealistic by the day. You sense the stress in him. The way power begins to slip through fingers that once controlled everything. This is still the well-known Tudor court. But now it's a pressure cooker with velvet walls. Henry's piety takes on an edge. He fasts. He obsesses. He frames his desire as duty. You hear him speak of England's future with genuine fear, as if the absence of a son is a crack through which chaos might return. The Wars of the Roses haunt him like an inherited nightmare. Some historians still debate whether Henry's fear is rational or inherited trauma amplified by power. Either way, it drives him forward. There's a faint, uncomfortable humor in the way solutions are discussed. Dispensations, annulments, papal permissions. The language becomes technical, almost bureaucratic. As if the right paperwork might fix heartbreak. You imagine trying to solve a marriage crisis with legal footnotes and Latin clauses. It's oddly modern, and just as ineffective. As night falls, you feel the atmosphere tightening. Catherine prays for patience. Henry prays for certainty. Rome delays. Everyone waits. You let the scene soften, aware that patience is thinning. And when it finally snaps, it won't break quietly. You notice her before she's formally noticed. Which is usually how trouble enters a room. Anne Boleyn doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. She arrives like a pause. Conversations stumble. Eyes track her movement just a little too obviously. She's not the most beautiful woman in the court. But she's the most awake. And in a palace full of careful silence. That's dangerous. Anne has spent time in the French court. And you can feel the difference immediately. She speaks with confidence. She laughs without checking the room first. She reads, debates, flirts, and withdraws with intention. This is the well-known turning point. Henry becomes infatuated. Then obsessed. But what often gets lost is how long this takes. This isn't a sudden passion, it's a slow, escalating fixation fed by resistance. Here's the strange detail that surprises many people. Anne refuses to become Henry's mistress. Not coyly, strategically. She understands the court well enough to know that proximity without protection is fatal. You feel how this refusal sharpens Henry's desire. Denial becomes fuel. Some historians still debate whether Anne genuinely loves Henry or simply understands leverage better than anyone else in the room. Standing here, you sense it's not an either-or situation. Henry's attention shifts publicly now. Catherine notices. Everyone notices. What was once whispered becomes visible. Anne is promoted. She's given titles, lands, status that quietly announce her importance. The court rearranges itself around this gravity, pretending nothing has changed while changing everything. You catch Catherine watching from a distance. Posture steady, expression controlled. The contrast between the two women is painful and precise. A well-known event anchors this section. Henry's determination to marry Anne becomes inseparable from his determination to end his marriage to Catherine. These are no longer parallel desires, they're the same problem. Rome delays again. The Pope is politically trapped. Henry's frustration turns outward. Advisors fall. Wolsey fails. You sense the shift from patience to anger, from persuasion to pressure. Religion starts to feel less comforting now. Scripture is no longer just read, it's interrogated. Henry listens closely to arguments that place kings above papal authority. You hear new ideas spoken more freely. Ideas that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Some historians still debate whether Henry is driven by theology or convenience. But you feel how belief and desire have fused into something rigid and self-justifying. There's a sharp, almost modern humor in watching a king argue that he's trapped by conscience while reshaping the conscience of an entire nation to suit his needs. You imagine someone insisting they're just following their truth, while bulldozing institutions centuries old. It would be funny if the consequences weren't so permanent. Anne, meanwhile, walks carefully. She is not safe yet. Every smile is measured. Every word is a test. She gains enemies simply by existing where Catherine once stood unchallenged. Some historians argue Anne's confidence is mistaken for arrogance. Others believe that in this court, modesty is simply invisibility by another name. As night settles, you feel the balance tip. This is no longer a marital dispute. It's a collision between desire, power, and belief. The court hums with anticipation and dread, as if everyone senses that something ancient is about to crack, and that when it does, nothing will fit back together the way it once did. You feel the crack finally widen. Slow at first, then all at once. The court doesn't gasp, it braces. This is the moment history remembers clearly. Henry VIII breaks with Rome. But living inside it feels less like a declaration and more like a series of doors closing behind you until turning back becomes impossible. The well-known event anchors everything here. England's separation from the authority of the Pope. It sounds clean in hindsight. It isn't. It unfolds through acts of parliament, legal arguments, and oaths that suddenly matter more than faith ever did before. You hear phrases like Supreme Head of the Church in England spoken aloud. Cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The room always goes quiet afterward, as if everyone is waiting to see whether lightning will strike. Here's a strange, often overlooked detail. Henry does not think of himself as abandoning Catholicism. He believes he is correcting it. Mass remains. Rituals remain. Doctrine barely shifts at first. The real change is jurisdiction. Who gets to decide? Some historians still debate whether Henry's break is a theological revolution or a legal coup dressed in religious language. Standing here, you feel how administrative it all sounds for something that will change lives so violently. Anne Boleyn's presence sharpens everything. Her future, and her safety, depend entirely on this break holding. You watch Henry grow more resolute, less tolerant of hesitation. Loyalty becomes something you prove, not something assumed. Oaths are required, refusals are noted, silence becomes suspicious. You imagine how exhausting it must be to live in a world where even your beliefs need paperwork. Catherine of Aragon refuses to accept the annulment. She does not scream. She does not fade quietly. She insists, calmly, repeatedly, that she is queen. You feel the moral tension this creates. Henry has the law on his side now. Catherine has conscience, history, and the quiet sympathy of much of the population. Some historians still argue whether Henry underestimates the emotional cost of casting her aside. Watching him here, you suspect he knows, but decides the cost is acceptable. The country begins to shift under your feet. Monasteries are visited, wealth is counted, allegiances are mapped. This isn't just about marriage anymore, it's about control. The crown discovers how much land and money faith has quietly accumulated. The realization is motivating. There's a dark joke in the air. God may be eternal, but property is very persuasive. Henry marries Anne in secret first, then publicly once the legal machinery catches up. The timing is deliberate, efficient. You sense his relief mixed with triumph. At last, no delays, no appeals, no Rome. Some historians still debate whether Henry feels victorious or merely committed beyond retreat at this point. The two emotions look similar from the outside. There's an uneasy calm after the break. England hasn't collapsed. The sky hasn't fallen. For Henry, this confirms everything. Authority has worked. Pressure has worked. You notice how this lesson lodges itself deeply in his thinking. When obstacles appear later, compromise will seem unnecessary, almost foolish. As evening settles, you let the magnitude of it all blur slightly. An ancient connection has been severed not by reformers in the streets, but by a king who wanted a different wife and found a way to make the universe agree. The air feels thinner now, sharper. You sense that England has crossed a line it can't uncross, and that Anne Boleyn, standing beside Henry, is both the symbol of this new world and its most fragile piece. You don't feel celebration so much as momentum. The machinery Henry has set in motion doesn't pause to admire itself, it keeps rolling. And Anne Boleyn is carried forward with it whether she's ready or not. The crown settles on her head in 1533. Light in gold, heavy in consequence. You stand close enough to see how carefully she holds her posture. How still she becomes, as if movement itself might invite disaster. This is the well-known moment. Anne Boleyn crowned Queen of England. The ceremony is lavish, deliberate, and unmistakably public. England is being told to accept her, to recognize this new order as legitimate. But beneath the velvet and bells, you feel how conditional her safety is. Anne is queen because Henry wills it, and Henry's will has already proven it can turn sharply. Here's a strange detail people rarely dwell on. Anne is pregnant at the time of her coronation. The future is literally inside her, fragile and already under scrutiny. You sense the pressure pressing inward from every direction. A son would silence doubts. Anything else would amplify them. Some historians still debate whether this urgency affects the decisions made around her fate later, but here, it already shapes every breath she takes. Elizabeth is born, not the longed-for boy but a healthy daughter. The announcement is polite, celebrations are measured, you feel the disappointment carefully concealed behind protocol. Henry adjusts quickly, outwardly affectionate, inwardly recalculating. Anne tells herself there will be time. You hear the clock start ticking anyway. The court turns colder. Allies become cautious. Enemies become patient. Anne has a sharp tongue and a memory for slights. And you notice how that no longer plays well now that she's queen. What once felt refreshing now feels dangerous. You can almost hear the collective thought, she should be more grateful. Some historians argue Anne's assertiveness seals her fate. Others insist her fate is decided the moment she fails to produce a son. Standing here, you feel how little room she truly has. A widely known event tightens the noose. Anne suffers miscarriages. Each one lands heavier than the last. The most devastating comes in 1536, a boy lost. The timing is cruel. Henry has already begun noticing Jane Seymour. You sense the pattern repeating. Familiar and chilling. History doesn't recycle ideas, it recycles solutions. Here's an uncomfortable, often overlooked detail. Accusations against Anne don't emerge gradually. They appear suddenly, fully formed, precise in their cruelty. Adultery, incest, treason, charges so extreme they feel designed not to be proven, but to overwhelm. Some historians still argue whether any of these accusations have basis in fact, or whether they are pure invention shaped to legal necessity. Watching the speed at which allies abandon her, you feel how little truth matters once power has decided to move on. The trial is swift, formal, almost bored. Anne defends herself with dignity that doesn't save her. Henry stays away. Distance becomes policy. You notice how absence replaces confrontation. It's easier to erase someone when you don't have to look at them. On the day of execution, the air feels unnaturally calm. A skilled swordsman is brought in. Mercy, of a sort. Anne speaks briefly, carefully. You hear no bitterness, only clarity. It's over quickly. History will remember the spectacle. You remember the quiet. As evening falls, the court exhales. A problem has been solved. Henry is free again. You feel the weight of that lesson settling into the palace walls. Queens are temporary. Solutions are repeatable. And affection, once it stops being useful, has a very short shelf life. You don't get time to process what just happened. The court certainly doesn't. Mourning is efficient here, measured in days. Sometimes hours, and then it's politely folded away like a black cloak no one plans to wear again. Anne Boleyn is barely gone when the atmosphere shifts, smoothing itself out, as if sharp edges have been quietly filed down overnight. You feel the palace recalibrate. Jane Seymour steps into this space without fanfare. That's the first thing you notice. No sparks, no drama, just softness. She lowers her eyes. She speaks carefully. She does not remind Henry of anything he'd rather forget. This is the well-known contrast historians love to point out. Where Anne challenged, Jane reassures. Where Anne debated, Jane agrees. You can almost hear Henry's shoulders drop in relief. A widely known event anchors this moment. Henry marries Jane Seymour less than 2 weeks after Anne's execution. The speed is startling, even by Tudor standards, yet no one openly questions it. You sense how exhaustion plays a role here, emotional fatigue disguised as decisiveness. Some historians still debate whether Henry truly loves Jane or simply recognizes peace when he sees it. Standing here, you suspect he values quiet more than passion now. Here's a strange detail that rarely gets much attention. Jane is never crowned queen. This isn't a snub, it's a calculation. Henry wants to wait until she produces a male heir before committing fully to ceremony. After Anne, optimism has become conditional. Jane seems to understand this instinctively. She doesn't demand symbols, she offers stability. Jane's influence is subtle but real. She advocates gently for reconciliation between Henry and his daughter Mary. Between the king and elements of the old faith, you notice how carefully she phrases requests, how she waits for moments when Henry feels generous. Some historians argue Jane's success comes not from intelligence or ambition, but from emotional timing. Others insist that restraint is intelligence in this environment. Watching her navigate the court, you feel how survival has its own kind of wisdom. And then, finally, the moment Henry has built his entire identity around arrives. In 1537, Jane gives birth to a son, Edward. Bells ring, guns fire, the country exhales. This is the universally recognized triumph, a legitimate male heir, born of a lawful English queen, free from papal shadow. You feel Henry's joy spill over into something close to euphoria. At last, the story makes sense to him. Here's the bitter detail history often rushes past. Jane's labor is long and brutal. Days stretch. The birth succeeds, but her body doesn't recover. Infection sets in quietly, the way it often does in this era. You sense dread returning before celebration has even cooled. Some historians still debate whether medical intervention could have saved her, or whether the outcome was inevitable. Either way, the result is final. Jane Seymour dies less than 2 weeks after giving Henry the one thing he's wanted above all else. The palace falls into a different kind of silence, one edged with guilt. Henry mourns genuinely this time. You can feel it in the way he withdraws, in the way he keeps Jane's memory pristine. She becomes the good wife, frozen safely in virtue and success. As night settles, you sense how this loss reshapes Henry more deeply than the others. Jane's death teaches him a dangerous lesson. The wife who gives him what he wants is the one taken away. From now on, affection will tangle with fear, and marriage will feel less like partnership and more like risk management. You let the moment soften, aware that the story is turning again. The heir exists, the grief lingers, and Henry, older now, heavier, and far less patient, will not be the same man who fell in love so recklessly before. The silence Jane leaves behind is heavier than the noise Anne ever made. You feel it settle over the court like a thick blanket, comforting at first, then suffocating. For the first time, Henry has what he wanted most. And yet nothing feels finished. Edward sleeps in his cradle, small and perfect, while the palace moves carefully around him, as if sound itself might undo the miracle. Jane becomes sacred in death. You notice how often her name is spoken softly, how no one dares compare her to anyone else. Henry clings to this memory with unusual tenderness. He orders that he be buried beside her one day. A decision that feels impulsive now but revealing. Some historians still debate whether Jane is truly his favorite wife or simply the only one who never had time to disappoint him. Standing here, you suspect that absence has polished her image far beyond reality. Henry himself is changing. This is the well-known shift into his middle years, when pain begins to shape personality. An old jousting injury flares up. His leg ulcer worsens, slow and relentless. You can almost smell the medicated bandages. The sharp herbs meant to mask decay. Mobility decreases. Patience thins. The king who once danced for hours now sits longer. Brooding. Power doesn't fade, but empathy does. Here's a strange, often overlooked detail. Henry becomes increasingly isolated not because no one is around him, but because fewer people tell him the truth. Advisors learn to soften bad news. Courtiers learn to flatter with precision. You feel the room adjusting itself around his moods like furniture rearranged daily. Some historians argue that Henry's physical pain accelerates his emotional hardening. Others believe power alone is enough to explain it. Watching him wince, you feel how the two intertwine. England, meanwhile, is restless. Religious change has not settled into clarity. Old beliefs persist quietly. New doctrines spread unevenly. Henry doesn't want chaos, he wants control. The dissolution of monasteries begins. A famous event with consequences rippling far beyond theology. Lands are seized. Wealth moves upward. You sense both opportunity and loss moving through the country at the same time. There's a dark humor in the way reform is sold as order. Imagine removing centuries-old institutions and calling it stability. It's a very Tudor move. Some historians still debate whether Henry understands the cultural damage being done or simply views monasteries as outdated expenses. Either way, the landscape, spiritual and physical, changes permanently. By now, Henry knows he will need another wife. An heir is not enough. Succession requires backups. The idea is discussed bluntly. Romance is no longer the language of marriage. Politics is. You hear names floated like items on a list. The warmth of earlier years is gone. What remains is calculation. As evening settles, you feel the court preparing itself again. Tightening routines. Rehearsing obedience. Edward sleeps. Jane rests in memory. And Henry, surrounded by power and pain, looks outward once more, not for love, but for solutions. You sense the court bracing itself before Henry ever speaks the decision aloud. Marriage is no longer a personal matter here. It's an administrative task with emotional consequences carefully filed away. The king is heavier now, slower in movement, sharper in temper. You hear his steps coming before you see him, and people instinctively straighten, like phones snapping shut when a boss walks by. The well-known historical shift anchoring this moment is Henry's growing suspicion, not just of women, but of everyone. Advisors are watched, words are weighed, loyalty is no longer assumed, it's audited. You feel how the palace has become a place where silence is safer than wit. The easy laughter of earlier years feels like a rumor someone once told you. Here's a strange detail most people don't dwell on. Henry sleeps poorly. Pain wakes him often, and nighttime thoughts have a way of turning into daytime policy. You imagine lying awake, leg throbbing, replaying disappointments, betrayals, near misses. Some historians still debate how much Henry's physical suffering affects his mental state. But standing in these dim corridors, you feel how discomfort sharpens suspicion. Edward's nursery becomes the emotional center of the palace. The boy is healthy, carefully protected, constantly observed. You notice how Mary and Elizabeth orbit at a distance, acknowledged, tolerated, but never central. The hierarchy is clear. Sons matter. Everything else is contingency planning. It's a cold logic, but one Henry believes the crown demands. Religion continues to shift under your feet. Henry positions himself as defender of the faith and its reformer at the same time. A balancing act that satisfies almost no one completely. Traditionalists resent change. Reformers resent limits. Henry resents both. Some historians argue that this ideological tension fuels his growing intolerance for disagreement. Others see it as simple fatigue. Either way, patience has left the building. There's a dark, almost modern humor in how fear is managed. Committees are formed, laws are passed, treason is defined more broadly than ever. You imagine updating terms of service so vaguely that everyone is technically in violation. It's efficient, it's terrifying, and it works. Henry's need for another wife returns. Stripped of romance, he wants insurance, youth, health, fertility. Those are the criteria now. You hear ambassadors whispering names from across Europe. Portraits are requested. Artists are sent out like scouts. Some historians still debate whether Henry truly believes a painting can capture compatibility. Watching him study these images, you feel how desperate practicality has replaced hope. As night settles, the palace grows quieter than it used to be. Not peaceful, controlled. You let the tension hum softly in the background, aware that the next marriage will not be born of love or patience, but of expectation and image. And that, in a court like this, is often where the worst misunderstandings begin. You feel the misunderstanding arrive before the bride ever does. It's carried in oil paint and careful lighting, folded neatly into a portrait that promises calm, youth, and uncomplicated obedience. Henry studies it longer than he studies most people now. This is the well-known setup, Anne of Cleves. Chosen not with the heart, but with the map, a Protestant alliance, a safe match. On paper, everything finally behaves. The painting works. That's the problem. Hans Holbein's portrait shows Anne serene, symmetrical, pleasing in a quiet way. Henry nods, approves, decides. You sense how much relief this brings him. No drama. No theology battles. No dangerous sparkle like Anne Boleyn's. Some historians still debate whether Henry truly blamed the artist later or whether the portrait simply gave him permission to rush. Standing here, you feel how badly he wants this to be easy. Anne arrives in England in winter. The cold suits the mood. Henry, impatient and curious, disguises himself and goes to meet her early, expecting a romantic surprise straight out of a chivalric fantasy. It goes poorly. Anne doesn't recognize him. She doesn't react correctly. She doesn't perform delight on cue. The king feels rejected in his own play. You can almost hear something snap quietly. This encounter becomes legendary, often exaggerated into cruelty or mockery. What's less often mentioned is how culturally mismatched the moment is. Anne doesn't speak English well. She doesn't share Henry's expectations of flirtation. Some historians still argue whether Henry's disappointment is aesthetic, emotional, or simply wounded pride. Watching him withdraw, you feel how quickly affection curdles when ego is involved. The marriage goes forward anyway. That's the widely known event. Ceremony without enthusiasm, betting without success. Henry complains, loudly, privately, endlessly. He insists the marriage is unconsummated. Anne, confused but pragmatic, does not argue. She understands survival better than romance. You feel the imbalance clearly now. One person wants escape. The other wants safety. Here's a strange, almost gentle detail. Anne adapts quickly. She learns English. She laughs when appropriate. She doesn't fight the annulment when it comes. Some historians argue that this flexibility saves her life. Others suggest she simply reads the room better than anyone else has in years. Standing here, you sense relief flowing back into her posture as danger quietly passes her by. The marriage is annulled within months. No scandal, no blood. Anne is granted a generous settlement and a new title, the king's sister. It's the closest thing to a happy ending any of Henry's wives will get. There's dark humor in that if you let yourself notice it. As evening settles, you feel the court relax slightly. A problem has been resolved without death. Henry, however, feels humiliated, and humiliation, for him, never fades quietly. It hardens. You let the image of the portrait blur and fade, aware that the next marriage will be driven less by caution and more by something reckless. Because nothing makes Henry more impulsive than feeling foolish. The humiliation doesn't cool, it ferments. You can feel it in the way Henry's patience evaporates, in how decisions snap shut without discussion. Being made to feel ridiculous is, for him, a far greater injury than being wrong. And so the court watches him do what he always does after embarrassment. Swing hard in the opposite direction. Youth re-enters the room like a draft through an unlatched window. Catherine Howard is barely more than a girl by court standards. Bright-eyed, laughing too easily, unaware that innocence is not armor here, it's bait. This is the well-known turn everyone remembers. Henry falls fast, deeply, and disastrously. He calls her his rose without a thorn, which sounds poetic until you realize how much pressure it puts on a human being to remain flawless. Here's a strange detail that often slips by. Henry is genuinely joyful during this brief period. He dresses better. He eats with appetite. He imagines himself younger than he is. Some historians still debate whether this marriage is about love or denial. But standing close enough to hear him laugh, you feel how badly he wants time to reverse itself. Catherine becomes less a wife and more a mirror. The wedding is quiet but celebratory. The court plays along, relieved to see the king smiling again. Catherine, meanwhile, is overwhelmed. She's been raised in loose supervision, educated imperfectly, and thrust suddenly into the most dangerous role in England. You sense how little preparation she's had for scrutiny that never sleeps. Some historians argue that Catherine doesn't understand what is expected of a queen. Others believe she understands too late. Either way, ignorance offers no protection. Rumors begin almost immediately. Old relationships resurface. Familiar faces linger too long. Catherine's past, once irrelevant, becomes explosive in this new context. You feel how unfair this is and how predictable it becomes anyway. The court thrives on secrets, but it punishes those who don't know how to hide them properly. Henry, at first, refuses to hear it. He defends her fiercely. Denial hardens into rage when evidence piles up. The transformation is brutal. The affection that once overflowed turns into disgust almost overnight. You notice how quickly language shifts, from endearments to legal terms. Some historians still debate whether Catherine is guilty of what she's accused of, or whether the standards applied to her are impossibly cruel. Standing here, you feel how irrelevant nuance becomes once the king feels betrayed. The fall is swift. Arrests, interrogations, confessions extracted under pressure. The machinery Henry perfected with Anne Boleyn activates again. Smoother this time. Practice helps. Catherine is stripped of titles, dignity, and future in a matter of weeks. You sense how shock keeps her quiet longer than fear does. On the day of execution, Catherine is said to practice placing her head on the block the night before. Whether true or embellished, the image lingers because it feels right. Some historians argue stories like this are later inventions meant to heighten tragedy. Others believe they reflect a young woman trying desperately to prepare for the unimaginable. As evening settles, the court is silent again, but not stunned this time. This ending has become familiar. Henry is free once more. But the freedom tastes stale. You feel the weight of repetition pressing in, aware that the pattern is no longer shocking. It's established, and that, somehow, is the most unsettling part. You feel the pattern trying to repeat itself, and then, quietly, failing. After Catherine Howard, the court doesn't rush. It hesitates. The mood is bruised, cautious, almost embarrassed by how predictable everything has become. Henry is older now, heavier, slower, and visibly tired of his own legend. Even the palace seems to move more carefully around him, like servants navigating a room full of fragile glass. This is where Catherine Parr enters, not with laughter or flirtation, but with competence. You notice her because she doesn't draw attention to herself. She's educated, composed, and already widowed twice, which in Tudor England counts as experience rather than misfortune. This is the well-known final marriage, Henry's sixth wife, chosen not for youth or beauty, but for steadiness. Some historians still debate whether Henry marries her out of affection or exhaustion. Standing here, you feel it's a mixture of both. Here's a strange, often overlooked detail. Catherine Parr is already in love with someone else when Henry proposes. Saying no to the king, however, is not a realistic option. You sense how carefully she reframes acceptance as duty. Survival here often looks like consent. Some historians argue that this emotional restraint is Catherine's greatest strength, and the reason she lives. The marriage changes the rhythm of the court. Catherine acts less like a consort and more like a caretaker. Henry's health is deteriorating rapidly now. His leg ulcer worsens, infection lingering beneath layers of bandage and pride. Pain dominates his days. You can almost feel how discomfort shortens his temper and narrows his world. Catherine manages this quietly, organizing schedules, smoothing tempers, absorbing anger that might otherwise lash outward. A well-known event grounds this phase. Catherine is named regent while Henry campaigns in France. This is not ceremonial. She governs. She signs documents. She manages resources. You sense how rare and dangerous this responsibility is. Some historians still debate how much authority she truly wields. But standing here, you feel the confidence with which she holds the reins. Competence, it turns out, is deeply attractive to a man running out of time. Religion, however, has not finished causing trouble. Catherine leans toward reformist ideas, reads forbidden books, discusses theology with dangerous openness. You feel the tension build again, not romantic this time, but ideological. Enemies watch closely. Accusations gather quietly. Some historians argue that Catherine comes dangerously close to sharing the fate of earlier queens. Others believe Henry's dependence on her saves her at the last moment. There's a soft, ironic humor in how Catherine survives. When confronted, she reframes her religious discussions as intellectual entertainment meant to distract the king from pain. Flattery, deployed precisely, becomes armor. Henry accepts it. Perhaps he wants to. The charges fade. The danger passes. As evening settles, you feel the court exhale cautiously. For the first time in years, the king's wife is not a problem to be solved. Catherine Parr remains standing, not because she is invisible, but because she understands the rules better than anyone else left in the room. You let the moment soften, aware that the end of Henry's story is approaching now, not with drama, but with weariness. You sense the air thinning again, not with panic this time, but with fatigue. The court has learned how to survive Henry, and Henry has learned how to endure himself. Everything moves more slowly now, conversations, decisions, even anger. What remains sharp is memory. No one forgets what has happened here, and that knowledge shapes every glance and pause. This phase is anchored by a familiar historical reality. Henry's health is failing fast. His leg ulcer refuses to heal, a constant source of pain and infection. You can almost feel the heat and pressure beneath the bandages. The way discomfort becomes background noise that never quite fades. Some historians still debate how much this chronic pain affects Henry's judgment. But standing near him, you sense how pain narrows the future into the present moment. Catherine Parr stays close, managing not just the household, but the king's mood. She reads to him, she listens, she distracts. It's caregiving disguised as queenship. Here's a lesser-known detail that lingers. Catherine begins writing, quietly, carefully, religious texts of her own. This is dangerous territory. A queen who thinks publicly is rarely safe. Some historians argue that her authorship marks a subtle shift in women's intellectual authority at court. Others see it as a personal risk taken with eyes wide open. The court itself feels hollowed out. Many familiar faces are gone, executed, exiled, retired into silence. New men rise quickly, often because they're untested and eager. You notice how governance becomes more fragmented. Decisions are delegated, sometimes contradicting one another. The machinery of state keeps running, but without the coherence it once pretended to have. Religion remains unsettled. England is officially reformed, but spiritually divided. You hear whispers of old practices continuing in secret, of new doctrines spreading unevenly. Henry enforces uniformity not because he's convinced of its truth, but because disagreement now feels exhausting. Some historians still debate whether Henry truly cares which path England takes by this point, or whether he simply wants quiet. Standing here, you feel how silence has become the ultimate luxury. There's a dark, almost tender humor in how fear operates now. People don't rush to please the king anymore, they cautiously avoid irritating him. You imagine living with someone whose temper is legendary and whose memory is excellent. It's not admiration that keeps order now, it's anticipation. As night settles, you feel the story slowing its pace, stretching its sentences. The fire burns lower. Henry rests more often. Catherine watches, patient and alert. The court holds its breath, not for the next marriage or execution, but for the inevitable ending approaching with the steady rhythm of time itself. You feel the court shrink inward, as if the walls themselves are tired of holding so much history. By now, everyone knows how this story tends to end, and that knowledge changes behavior more than any law ever could. Voices soften, footsteps hesitate, even ambition learns to walk on tiptoe. This part of the reign is anchored by a familiar truth. Henry rules increasingly through others. Councils meet without him, papers arrive already summarized, decisions are nudged into place before he signs them. Power hasn't vanished, it's simply become heavier than he wants to lift every day. Some historians still debate whether this delegation weakens the monarchy or preserves it during Henry's decline. Standing here, you feel how exhaustion can masquerade as strategy. Catherine Parr remains the calm center of this narrowing world. She manages Henry's daughters carefully, especially Mary and Elizabeth, encouraging reconciliation without provoking resistance. This is a widely known outcome of her influence. The girls are restored to the line of succession. It's a quiet repair job, done without ceremony, but its importance echoes far beyond this moment. You sense Catherine choosing long-term stability over short-term approval, a rare move in this court. Here's a strange detail that often goes unnoticed. Henry seems to soften toward his children as his strength fades. He spends time watching them rather than instructing them. Some historians argue this is guilt surfacing late. Others suggest it's simply the narrowing focus of age. Standing here, you feel how mortality rearranges priorities without asking permission. The court remains dangerous, just differently so. Religious factions still watch one another closely. Old grudges linger. Accusations don't vanish, they wait. You notice how Catherine Parr never forgets this. How she measures every word even as the king weakens. Survival has taught her precision. There's a quiet irony threading through this period. Henry, who once reshaped an entire church to satisfy his will, now struggles to control his own body. Pain dictates schedule. Infection dictates mood. You sense how humbling this is, even if he never admits it aloud. Some historians still debate whether Henry understands the scale of what he's built or broken. Watching him now, you suspect understanding arrives, but too late to change anything. As evening settles again, you feel time itself slow, stretching gently. The court doesn't brace for shock anymore. It waits, and waiting, after everything you've seen, feels almost merciful. Waiting changes its texture now. It's no longer sharp with fear or expectation, it's padded, muffled, like sound wrapped in thick cloth. You move through the palace and feel how everything has been arranged for endurance rather than ambition. Fires are kept steady, Meals are simpler. Schedules bend around Henry's pain. The court has learned that the king's body is now the clock. This phase is anchored by a well-known reality. Henry VIII is no longer fully in control of his own movements. He is carried more often than he walks. Chairs appear before he asks for them. You notice how people anticipate his needs seconds before he voices them. Not out of affection, but out of habit sharpened by years of consequence. Some historians still debate how aware Henry is of his own decline. Standing here, you feel that he knows, he just refuses to discuss it. Catherine Parr remains close, but not intrusive. She has mastered the art of presence without pressure. She reads to him when he asks. She leaves when silence is safer. Here's a lesser-known detail. Catherine quietly encourages Henry to think about education and governance beyond himself. She speaks of Edward's tutors, of curricula, of preparing a future that will not depend on sheer force of personality. Some historians argue this guidance shapes the early direction of Edward's reign more than Henry ever acknowledges. Henry's temper still flares, but it burns shorter now. Anger exhausts him. You see moments where irritation collapses into weariness, where commands trail off unfinished. It's unsettling. Watching a man whose voice once bent institutions now struggle to finish a sentence. Power hasn't left him, but stamina has. Religion remains unresolved, suspended in a strange middle state Henry insists upon. He neither fully embraces reform nor restores Catholic unity. This deliberate ambiguity becomes policy. Some historians still debate whether Henry believes compromise is wisdom or simply the only option left. You sense that certainty requires energy he no longer has. There's a faint, almost tender humor in how the court adapts. Everyone pretends this is normal. That king's age, that empire's pause. You imagine a company insisting everything is business as usual, while quietly preparing succession plans. It's polite denial at a national scale. Henry spends more time alone now. Not isolated, protected. You notice the way corridors empty when he passes. How silence follows him like a shadow. Some historians argue this solitude deepens his introspection. Others believe it's simply the cost of being dangerous for too long. Standing near him, you feel both explanations overlap. As night settles, you let the quiet stretch. The story has slowed its pace deliberately, as if aware that rushing would feel disrespectful. The king breathes, the court waits, and somewhere beneath the weight of habit and memory, England prepares, carefully, silently, for a future that will arrive whether anyone is ready or not. You feel the future leaning closer now. Close enough to hear it breathe. The waiting has shifted from patience to preparation, and the court no longer pretends otherwise. Papers move more deliberately. Conversations end with quieter conclusions. Everyone is thinking about what comes after, even if no one says the word out loud. This section settles around a well-known historical reality. Henry begins actively arranging the succession. It's practical, meticulous, and faintly anxious. Wills are drafted, revised, redrafted again. You watch advisors debate language as if commas might hold the kingdom together. Edward is named heir, of course, but Mary and Elizabeth are restored carefully behind him, ranked like contingencies no one wants to test. Some historians still debate whether Henry does this out of fatherly concern or dynastic fear. Standing here, you feel it's both, love filtered through control. Here's a strange detail that rarely gets attention. Henry obsesses over ceremony even now. Funerals, coronations, processions not yet needed. He wants order to outlive him. You imagine planning your own exit with the same intensity you once planned wars. It's oddly human. Some historians argue this fixation reveals insecurity. Others see it as the final expression of a king who believes structure is salvation. Edward is brought forward more often. Tutors report progress. Lessons grow heavier, more theological, more political. You sense how much weight is being placed on a child's shoulders that barely support his own health. Henry watches closely, proud and worried in equal measure. The irony hums quietly. The son meant to secure everything is also fragile. Just in a different way. Catherine Parr continues her careful work. She mediates between siblings, encouraging Mary and Elizabeth to coexist without rivalry. This is no small task. You feel the tension in shared rooms, the unspoken history hanging between them. Some historians argue Catherine's influence here prevents future disaster. Others believe the fractures are simply delayed. Standing here, you sense how delicate the balance really is. Religion remains a minefield. Henry enforces obedience not because he believes unity is achievable, but because division feels dangerous now. You notice how enforcement replaces persuasion entirely. Laws are maintained because they exist, not because anyone believes they are perfect. Fatigue has made certainty impractical. There's a dark, almost sleepy humor in how final decisions are framed. Everything is temporary, even when everyone knows it isn't. You imagine calling permanent changes interim measures, just to make them easier to swallow. It's a very Tudor way to manage anxiety. As evening settles, you feel the story narrowing again, funneling toward a conclusion it can no longer avoid. The court is quieter than ever. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Henry rests longer now, breathing measured. The weight of his choices pressed gently but firmly against the end of his days. You notice how time begins to blur at the edges now. Days slide into one another, not marked by events but by symptoms, good mornings, bad nights, stretches of uneasy calm. The court still functions, still bows and whispers, but it feels increasingly like a machine running on memory rather than momentum. Henry VIII is alive, undeniably so, yet no longer fully present in the world he shaped. This stage of the story is anchored by a familiar historical truth. Henry's health deteriorates rapidly in his final years. His leg ulcer worsens. Infection lingering despite constant care. Fever comes and goes. Pain dulls concentration. You can almost hear the shallow patience in his voice. How even issuing commands costs him effort now. Some historians still debate whether Henry's physical decline directly affects the severity of his late policies. But standing close enough to feel the strain, you sense how pain simplifies choices, often toward harshness. Here's a strange, often overlooked detail. Henry becomes increasingly fixated on obedience, even in small matters, not rebellion, hesitation. A pause before agreement irritates him. A suggestion framed as advice rather than compliance lands poorly. You feel how authority, when threatened by mortality, seeks reassurance everywhere. Some historians argue this obsession reflects fear of being forgotten rather than fear of losing control. Watching him here, you feel how closely the two are linked. The court adjusts accordingly. Advisors speak in shorter sentences. Reports are filtered. Catherine Parr remains one of the few people who can still contradict Henry gently without consequence. She does it carefully, wrapping disagreement in concern. This is survival refined to an art form. You sense how exhausting this must be, to think strategically while someone else grows unpredictable. Religion flares again. Briefly, conservative factions attempt to move against Catherine, reviving accusations of heresy. This is a well-known near-miss in her story. Papers are drawn up, warrants prepared. You feel danger creep back into rooms that had grown accustomed to stability. Some historians still debate whether Henry fully understands what is unfolding, or whether Catherine saves herself through timing and humility alone. Catherine survives by leaning into submission at exactly the right moment, apologizing for debating theology and reframing it as harmless conversation meant to distract the king from pain. Henry accepts this explanation, perhaps because he wants to. The charges vanish. The crisis dissolves. You feel how narrow the escape truly is. One misjudged word, one slower apology, and the ending would be very different. As Henry weakens, his moods soften unevenly. He reflects aloud more often, sometimes repeating stories from his youth, tournaments, triumphs, promises that once felt endless. You hear pride mixed with confusion, as if the man he was and the man he is are struggling to recognize each other. Some historians argue Henry never regrets his actions. Others believe regret surfaces obliquely, never named. Standing here, you sense it hovering just outside language. As night settles, you feel the court moving into a kind of suspended gentleness. No one rushes, no one provokes. The story is nearing its quietest stretch, not peaceful, not resolved, but hushed. Henry rests more deeply now. Breath slower, the echoes of 6 marriages and countless decisions pressing softly against the end that is drawing close. Whether anyone wishes to say it aloud or not, you sense the end before it announces itself. It arrives not as a moment, but as a thinning of voice, of appetite, of the need to be right. The palace grows unusually gentle, padded with caution and routine. Fires are kept steady through the night. Doors open quietly. Everyone has learned that sudden sounds are unkind now. This stretch of history is anchored by a well-known truth. Henry is preparing to die. Whether he admits it or not, physicians come and go with practiced neutrality. Remedies are applied that smell sharp and hopeful and do very little. You can almost feel the room adjusting its expectations downward. Some historians still debate whether Henry understands his condition clearly or chooses not to acknowledge it. Standing here, you feel how denial and acceptance can share the same space without arguing. Here's a strange, often overlooked detail. Henry becomes deeply concerned with how he will be remembered. Not just as king, but as right. He revisits old decisions, asking for confirmation rather than confession. He doesn't say, "Was I wrong?" He asks, "It was necessary, wasn't it?" You hear this phrasing repeated, gently affirmed by those who know better than to hesitate. Some historians argue this need for validation replaces remorse. Others believe it is remorse, translated into a safer language. Catherine Parr remains close, but quieter now. She listens more than she speaks. When she does speak, it's reassuring, grounding. She reminds Henry of order, of continuity, of Edward's future, of England standing beyond him. You feel the relief this brings. Power has always been heavy for Henry, but letting go of it feels heavier still. The children visit carefully. Edward is brought in, coached on posture and words. You notice how small he looks beside the bed, how solemn his face becomes when he senses the gravity of the moment. Mary stands straight, composed, carrying years of survival in her silence. Elizabeth watches, alert and observant, absorbing everything. Some historians still debate how deeply these moments imprint themselves on the future rulers they will become. Standing here, you feel how memory roots itself quietly. Religion softens at the edges. Henry asks for prayers, not arguments. Ritual returns to comfort rather than control. You notice how this circles back to the beginning, to a young king who once believed faith would protect him from uncertainty. The irony is gentle now, not sharp. There's a subdued, almost tender humor in how the court pretends this is just another winter illness. Blankets are adjusted, schedules delayed, everyone speaks in the future tense. Carefully, you imagine a family insisting everything is fine while quietly preparing farewell meals. It's human, it's fragile. As evening settles, the room dims further. Henry's breathing slows, uneven but steady. The king who once reshaped marriages, churches, and lives now rests, dependent on others to manage even his comfort. You let the moment blur, knowing the story is approaching its final exhale, one that will not echo with commands, but with the quiet closing of a chapter that has already reshaped everything around it. The room feels smaller now, not because the walls have moved, but because the future has stepped closer. You sense how carefully everyone breathes, as if air itself might be a finite resource. Henry VIII is still alive, still king, but the authority that once filled rooms ahead of him now lingers quietly at the bedside, waiting its turn to leave. This moment is anchored by a well-known historical event, Henry's final days in January 1547. He drifts in and out of awareness, speech slowing, thoughts loosening their grip on order. You can hear fragments, half-finished sentences, familiar names repeated like anchors. Some historians still debate how lucid Henry is at the very end, but standing close enough to feel the stillness between words, you sense that clarity now comes in flashes, not stretches. Here's a strange, often overlooked detail. Henry dies without making a public confession. There is no dramatic reckoning, no sweeping apology. Instead, he follows ritual, final prayers, formal acknowledgments, the structure he has always trusted to speak when he cannot. Some historians argue this reflects confidence to the end. Others believe it reflects fear of saying the wrong thing once it's too late. Either way, silence becomes his final strategy. The court is already shifting its posture. Messages are prepared but not sent. Doors are guarded more closely. You feel how quickly loyalty begins reorienting itself toward the future, even while the present still breathes. It's not cruelty, it's survival. The machine must keep running. Some historians still debate whether this transition happens out of habit or calculation. Watching it unfold, you feel how automatic it has become. When the moment arrives, it's quiet, no announcement at first, just a pause that stretches a second too long. Then a recognition passes through the room. Subtle and synchronized. Henry VIII is gone. The man who bent England around his will leaves behind a body that no longer commands anything at all. Edward is proclaimed king carefully, cautiously, wrapped in layers of procedure meant to compensate for his age. You feel the weight shift, not disappear, but move. Henry's reign ends not with collapse or chaos, but with transfer. Some historians argue this smooth succession is his final success. Others believe it simply delays reckoning. Standing here, you sense both interpretations breathing side by side. As night settles, the palace exhales in a way it hasn't in decades. Fear doesn't vanish, but it changes shape. The name Henry will no longer cause rooms to quiet instantly. That alone feels enormous. You let the echoes of his footsteps fade down corridors he will never walk again. Aware that what remains is not just memory, but consequence, long, layered, and still unfolding. You don't feel an abrupt ending. You feel an echo, the kind that lingers after a heavy door closes, vibrating faintly through stone long after the sound itself is gone. Henry VIII is dead, but he hasn't left the building, not really. His choices still hang in the air, woven into law, religion, memory, and the lives of the 6 women who shared his crown and paid for it in very different ways. This final stretch is anchored by the well-known historical reality that Henry's reign is remembered less for what he built than for what he broke, and what he forced to be rebuilt in his image. England is no longer Catholic in the old sense. Not fully Protestant either. It is something uniquely unsettled. Some historians still debate whether Henry intended this ambiguity as balance or simply left a mess he never finished cleaning up. Standing here, you feel how unfinished everything remains. Here's a strange, often overlooked truth. Henry's 6 wives are remembered as a rhyme because that's easier than remembering them as people. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's neat, memorable, and deeply unfair. Each woman entered his orbit under different rules, different expectations, different dangers. Catherine of Aragon's endurance, Anne Boleyn's intelligence, Jane Seymour's quiet obedience, Anne of Cleves' adaptability, Catherine Howard's youth, Catherine Parr's intellect and caution. History flattens them. You don't. You sense how Henry's story has eclipsed theirs for centuries, turning complex lives into footnotes orbiting one man's appetite and fear. Some historians still argue whether Henry is a product of his time or an outlier even by Tudor standards. Watching the long shadow he leaves behind, you suspect the answer is, inconveniently, both. The children carry this legacy forward. Edward inherits a kingdom shaped by force and reform, too young to hold either. Mary inherits pain sharpened by faith and memory. Elizabeth inherits observation, years of watching what power does to people. The future of England is already inside them, shaped by the marriages that came before. Now, the pace slows, deliberately. Your breathing evens out as the palace fades, not in flames, not in applause, but into quiet continuity. Tapestries dim, footsteps soften, the weight of crowns becomes a distant pressure rather than an immediate threat. You're reminded, gently, that history isn't loud all the way through. It's long, it hums, It settles into people's lives and stays there, often unnoticed, shaping habits and fears and expectations long after the main character exits the stage. So you let the images blur now. The faces soften, the echoes fade. Your thoughts grow slower, heavier, kinder. And as the story finally loosens its grip, you rest in the quiet left behind, aware that power passes. People remain, and sleep, at last, is allowed to arrive. End of script. Sweet dreams.